Seat 2A, please, he said, soft but firm. But she wasn't having it. Not today. Blonde ice queen, name tag glinting Deborah, already decided this kid, all of 10 years, didn't belong. First class, please? The air crackled, unspoken. See, what she didn't know was Micah wasn't just some kid. He had clearance, connections, power that could ground a damn airline. He just sat there, quiet dignity radiating off him like heat. Didn't argue, didn't cry, made her furious. She was about to escalate. Big mistake. Because Micah's silence? That wasn't fear. It was a signal, the kind that brings down empires. And Deborah? She had no clue what quiet kindness she'd just weaponized. Whispered phones lifted, yet the woman who delivered the blow carried on blind to the storm she had just unleashed. What she didn't know was that Micah's quiet strength would travel far beyond that cabin, reaching boardrooms and headlines. With one call, her arrogance would trigger a reckoning powerful enough to ground an entire airline. Micah Ellison didn't like loud spaces, not because he was afraid of them, but because silence made more sense to him. He liked the way quiet moments stretched between things, the hum of a refrigerator late at night, the soft sigh of air vents above his bed, the way people's words changed when they thought no one was listening. At 10 years old, Micah understood more than most people thought. He didn't advertise it. He just watched, listened, and stayed composed. That morning, he sat alone at Gate 47B at Seattle International Airport. He wore a soft red hoodie zipped to the top, khaki joggers, and black and white sneakers that had been cleaned the night before. A navy blue duffel sat by his feet. His boarding pass was tucked neatly inside the front pocket of his backpack. LunaJet flight LJ88 to New York was boarding soon. A nearby flight announcement crackled overhead. But Micah didn't flinch. Instead, he stared out the large pane of glass at the aircraft parked just beyond the window. The fuselage gleamed in the cold sunlight, a silver and blue streak reflecting the sky. He imagined what the cabin would smell like. Leather lavender disinfectant and that sterile new plane scent that clung to the first-class section. He belonged in seat 2A. His mother had booked it personally, but he also knew what it meant walking onto a first-class cabin alone with dark skin and no visible adult in tow. Still, he didn't feel afraid. A soft buzz pulsed on his wrist, his smart band. He tapped it, reading the green notification that flashed silently. Verified seat 2A flight LJ88 level alpha clearance confirmed. Micah didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed a little. He remembered what his mom had told him before the car dropped him off at the private security terminal. People may see you before they see your seat. Don't worry, you don't have to explain. Just exist. Let the rest unfold. When the boarding call for Group 1 echoed through the terminal, Micah stood without hesitation. He approached the gate calmly and extended his boarding pass to the gate agent. The woman glanced down, startled for a second. Then she forced a smile. "Hi there, sweetie. Are you traveling alone?" Micah nodded. "Yes, and ma'am. My mother arranged everything. I'm in 2A. She looked again at the pass. Green light. Beep. Cleared. "Oh, all right," she said slowly, clearly uncertain. "Just follow the jet bridge, okay?" He gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." As he walked past her, a man in his 50s, gray-tiered and clean-cut, glanced over the rim of his glasses. He wore a charcoal suit and a wool coat slung over one arm. His carry-on bag looked expensive, but understated. He watched Micah walk away, then followed quietly behind inside the aircraft. A junior flight attendant named Amamira Calderon smiled warmly as Micah stepped into the doorway. "Welcome aboard," she greeted. "Thank you," Micah replied. His voice was soft but confident. He scanned the cabin and found his seat 2A right by the window. The leather was cream-colored, the cushions wide and firm. He placed his duffel under the seat ahead and pulled off his hoodie, folding it neatly on his lap. He had just begun to look out the window again when a new voice interrupted the calm. It was sharp, efficient, coded, with the kind of authority that didn't like to be questioned. "Excuse me," came the voice. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Micah turned. The lead flight attendant stood above him. She was tall, perhaps in her early 50s, with meticulously pinned blonde hair and a posture so rigid it looked painful. Her name tag read, Deborah C.R. Micah blinked slowly. Yes, ma'am. This is my seat. Deborah's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. This is first class, she said, as if clarifying something Micah couldn't have possibly known. I know, he said. I'm in 2A. My mother booked it for me. She glanced down at his clothes, at his skin, at his duff, at his smart band. She didn't nod, didn't step aside. She said, well, sometimes seat assignments get jumbled for minors. Just stay put for now. Micah gave a small nod and looked back toward the window behind her. The gray-suited man quietly took his seat in 3C. He unfolded a newspaper and tilted it slightly so he could see both Micah and Deborah. Deborah walked briskly toward the galley, her heels clicking with impatience. From across the aisle in 2D, an elderly woman with silver hair and a floral scarf watched the exchange with quiet interest. She'd seen the way the flight attendant's eyes narrowed. She'd seen that kind of look before in classrooms, in courtrooms, in decades of subtle battles. Micah stayed silent, hands folded neatly in his lap. The cabin filled slowly. Other passengers arrived, businessmen, influencers, a couple talking about wine pairings. No one else noticed the boy in two-way, but attention had already taken root like the invisible pressure just before a storm. Deborah returned 10 minutes later, this time holding a clipboard. Her expression was tight. I checked the manifest, she said flatly. You're not listed as an unaccompanied minor. Micah reached calmly into his duffel and pulled out a folded letter. My mom asked me to show this if anyone asked. It has her signature and the foundation seal. Deborah took it without thanks. She glanced at it for no more than 2 seconds before scoffing. This doesn't prove anything. Anyone can print a letter. Micah's voice stayed even. That's my mother's seal. I said enough, Deborah snapped. Then in a single motion, she tore the letter in half. The sound cracked through the quiet cabin. Micah's jaw clenched. His eyes stayed on the paper as it crumpled in her hand. We'll get you a more appropriate seat, Deborah said. Somewhere you'll be more comfortable. From the seat behind, the man in 3C, Theo Price, lowered his newspaper. Excuse me, he said quietly. That child's been in that seat since boarding. Deborah turned annoyed. Sir, this doesn't concern you? Theo raised an eyebrow. Actually, it might. Deborah ignored him. She turned back to Micah. Stand up, she ordered. Micah hesitated, then slowly slid out of the seat, his hands clenched at his sides. The ripped letter trembled in his grip. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply stood beside his seat, still like a statue as the cabin filled with the weight of everything that had just happened. Across the aisle, Mrs. Rao reached for her phone. She didn't say a word, but she hit record. The sound of the torn paper lingered in the cabin longer than it should have. It cut through the filtered air and quiet engine hum like the crack of lightning in a still forest. Passengers didn't gasp. Not yet, but they felt something shift. Something delicate had just been broken. Micah stood next to seat 2 way back, straight eyes fixed on the crumpled halves of the letter in Deborah Krantz's hand. It wasn't the first time someone had dismissed him. It wasn't even the first time someone had questioned why he was in a place like this. But this time, the dismissal wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message. You don't belong here. He pressed his lips together and said nothing. Deborah dropped the pieces of the letter onto the drink tray and clicked her pen twice as if resetting her authority. Her uniform was perfectly tailored, not a wrinkle in sight, and her voice had taken on a clipped professional tone that masked the sharpness underneath. You'll need to wait in the back until we can find a more suitable seat. She didn't look at Micah when she said it. She spoke over him around him to the invisible audience of imagined protocol from across the aisle. Mrs. Lillian Rowe narrowed her eyes. Excuse me, she said softly. Deborah turned. Yes, that boy has done absolutely nothing wrong. Deborah forced a smile. Ma'am, I assure you this is a procedural issue. Lillian Rowe didn't blink. I've been watching. He boarded quietly, spoke politely, and hasn't disturbed a soul. You tore up a letter that could have clarified everything. Deborah's nostrils flared, but her voice remained sugary. The manifest does not list him properly. That letter was unofficial. She turned away and walked back toward the galley without further explanation. Micah remained standing, holding on to the shredded document as if it still held power. In 3C, Theo Price quietly opened a leather-bound planner and slipped out a slim black device. With a quick tap of his finger, he activated a secure audio recording. He didn't make eye contact with Micah. Not yet. That time would come. For now, his role was to observe and document. Passengers continued boarding. A couple in 2C and 2D arrived wheeling sleek carry-ons and exchanging hushed remarks about a property in the Hamptons. They barely noticed Micah standing by his seat until the man turned slightly and saw the tiers of paper on the tray table. "Is something wrong here?" he asked. Micah didn't answer. Mrs. Rowe did. "Apparently it's wrong for a child to sit in a first-class seat these days." The man raised his eyebrows, but his wife touched his arm gently, a silent gesture that said, "Don't get involved." "Not yet." Micah didn't move. Inside his chest, his heart pounded quietly, not with panic, but with something more complicated, a sadness wrapped in restraint, a familiar weight he had trained himself to carry. He thought about calling his mom. Dr. Alana Ellison would already be in transit, likely on her way to a policy meeting in New York. She had said it would be a quick trip for him, a routine flight, no press, no escort, just him, his thoughts, and the clouds outside the window. He remembered her last words before the car door closed. "If they ever question you, don't argue. If they make you feel small, don't shrink. You are not here to prove you belong. Just breathe, baby. Breathe. And signal." He looked down at his wrist. The smart band gleamed quietly under the soft cabin light. He brought his left hand over his rot and slowly placed 2 fingers on the band's face. 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds. The screen blinked once. A silent signal level, 2 minor alert. Authenticated elsewhere. Deep inside the secure server center of the Ellison Foundation in Washington, D.C., a blinking notification appeared on a panel. Asset ID Micah E. Ellison Flight LJ88 status. Seated disruption emergency confirmed. Priority hold position track on. Inside the cockpit, a quiet ping lit up the co-pilot's panel. A red light flashed briefly, then turned blue. The alert didn't explain what had happened. It didn't need to. It simply instructed, "Do not depart." In the main cabin, the last of the passengers took their seats. The captain's voice came on over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received an updated hold from ground control. Please remain seated while we await further clearance for departure. We apologize for the brief delay." Passengers shifted in their seats. Overhead, bins clicked, close seatbelts fastened in 2A. Micah sat down without a word. He placed the torn letter gently on the tray in front of him and rested his hands on his lap. Across the aisle, Mrs. Rowe leaned slightly toward him. "You all right, sweetheart?" Micah nodded once. He didn't meet her eyes. He stared straight ahead through the headrest, past the aisle, past the noise in the galley. Deborah Krantz tapped through her tablet, searching for a way to validate her decision. She didn't like being questioned, especially not by passengers. She had worked flights for 25 years. She had memorized every emergency code, every manifest nuance. She knew how to command a cabin, but this boy was making her feel off balance, and she didn't know why. She turned to Amamira Calderon, the younger attendant who had greeted Micah earlier. "Dolk, check his profile again." "Would you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Amamira hesitated. "I already scanned it." It cleared green. "That can be faked. Just confirm." Amamira tapped into the system again. As she read, her brow furrowed. "There's a flag here. Line 17. What does it say? Level Alpha. Special Services. Contact Ellison Security if protocols breached." Deborah leaned in. "That's ridiculous. A kid can't be Level Alpha. It's probably a glitch." Amamira looked up. "Have you ever seen a Level Alpha designation on a domestic flight?" "No. And that's exactly why it's probably a mistake." Amamira paused. "Deb, maybe we should do not finish that sentence." Deborah's voice dropped an octave, edged with warning. "If you want to keep this job, you'll follow my lead." "Got it." Amamira didn't speak. She just nodded once and stepped away. Back in seat 2A, Micah gently reached into the side pouch of his bag and pulled out a small sealed envelope. He didn't open it. He placed it gently beside the torn letter. It was the second copy of his clearance, embossed with the golden seal of the Ellison Foundation and signed by his mother. He had hoped he wouldn't need it. Across the cabin, Theo Price tapped his phone under the seat again. Then he slid out a second device from the inside pocket of his blazer. Secure matte black. No logo. He tapped a silent command. Then he whispered to himself just loud enough for the audio feed to catch it. Micah has signaled. Situation escalating. Flight LJ-88. Authorization granted. He leaned back in his seat and waited. Outside, the plane remained motionless on the tarmac. The jet bridge hadn't pulled away. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Passengers whispered something was happening, something more than just a delay. And at the center of it all, a boy sat silently beside a torn letter in a sealed envelope. Eyes calm, breath steady. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had already sent the signal. The wheels had begun to roll just barely, just enough to whisper across the tarmac. Micah Ellison felt the shift under his seat, the subtle forward motion of a plane ready to take flight. But then it stopped. Not slowed, not paused. It stopped completely. A strange silence fell over the cabin. It wasn't the usual quiet that came before takeoff, the polite hush of business travelers silencing their devices or reaching for magazines. The silence had a different weight to it, a held breath, a loaded pause like the plane itself was listening. A soft chime echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we have received updated instructions from ground control. We are being asked to hold position at the gate for a few more minutes. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. The captain's voice was calm, professional, but even that tone couldn't mask the current now running through the cabin. Passengers looked at each other. Some shifted uncomfortably, others glanced toward the windows. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot looked up from the console. That alert, it came with a priority hold. He set his voice low. The captain didn't reply immediately. He was reading a message that had appeared on his private operations tablet. Passenger Alpha E12 has triggered Protocol 321. Confirm hold. Delay taxi clearance. Await further instruction. He looked back at the co-pilot. Pull up the internal camera logs. Forward them to LunaJet Corporate. The co-pilot nodded in two-way. Micah sat quietly. He hadn't moved since sending the signal. His hands remained folded in his lap, the sealed envelope and torn letter still resting on the tray before him. His eyes were fixed on the back of the seat in front of him, but his mind was somewhere else. Not in fear, not even in frustration, but in a kind of focused stillness his mother had taught him to use when the world grew unfair. Across the aisle, Mrs. Lillian Rowe tapped her phone screen. She wasn't scrolling, she was recording. The boy hadn't said a word since the flight attendant humiliated him, and yet every detail of his restraint spoke louder than any outburst could have. Behind Micah in 3C, Theo Price adjusted his cuff and glanced toward the aisle. The time for passive observation was nearly over. His phone vibrated once beneath his tray table. He tapped the side of his seat, confirming reception of the signal. Security escalation verified from the galley. Deborah C.R. emerged once more, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. She walked past Micah without acknowledging him, and instead began checking in with other first-class passengers. Her voice had taken on a sickly sweetness. "Still or sparkling water for you?" she asked the couple in 2C and 2D. "We're fine, thank you," the woman replied coolly. Her eyes flicked toward Micah, who still hadn't spoken. Deborah moved on. Behind her, Amamira Calderon stood frozen in the galley doorway. Her eyes followed every movement, hands fidgeting behind her back. She had seen the designation level Alpha. She had read the name again and again. Micah Ellison, not just a child, not just a passenger, a name that belonged to a foundation, to a mother who made laws bend to a boy whose existence right now had triggered a corporate-level delay and possibly something bigger. Amamira took a deep breath and walked toward the cockpit. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but silence no longer felt safe. On her way, she passed Theo Price. He looked up, not smiling but steady. "It's time," he said quietly. She nodded and kept walking. Meanwhile, Micah reached for the sealed envelope, not to open it, but to reposition it slightly. He centered it on the tray, smoothing it down with 2 fingers as if aligning his place in the world. "You didn't cry, did you?" The voice came from across the aisle. Micah looked up. Mrs. Rowe was watching him with kind eyes. "I saw it happen," she continued. "Saw how she spoke to you. How she ripped that letter. Micah said nothing. You don't have to say a word, she added. But I want you to know I believe you, and I'm not the only one. Micah offered a small nod. That was all. At the rear of the cabin, murmurs were growing. Something had shifted. The hold on the flight wasn't just about air traffic. People could feel it. The energy had changed. The teenage girl in row 5 nudged her friend and whispered, Do you see the kid up there? He's just sitting there totally still. He hasn't said a single word since she yelled at him. Her friend replied, I was filming a TikTok earlier and caught part of it. You filmed that? Yeah. Look, the clip showed Deborah snapping at Micah, tearing his letter and instructing him to stand. There was no context needed. Her voice, his silence, it told the entire story. Post it, the friend said. That's insane. Back in 2A. Micah felt his wristband buzz again. A silent acknowledgement. Message received. Help is listening. He took a slow breath and exhaled, grounding himself. He thought of the conversation with his mom 3 nights ago, curled up on the balcony couch, watching airplanes blink across the night sky. What if someone says I don't belong? He had asked her. Then they've just confessed their weakness, she'd said. But what if they hurt me? Then you'll remember who you are. You won't fight fire with fire. You'll hold your shape. That's what real power looks like. He hadn't fully understood her then, but now sitting in 2A with a burning cheek and a storm around him, he did. Power wasn't volume. It was restraint, and sometimes the world had to be forced to notice the quiet things. Deborah returned from the galley, walking briskly up the aisle. She passed a mirror without a glance and stopped directly in front of Micah. I've had enough, she said quietly. This little protest of yours is over. She reached for the sealed envelope on his tray table. Micah placed his hand over it. You're not allowed to touch that, he said evenly. His voice was calm, controlled, but it was the first thing he'd said since the boarding gate. Deborah froze. Her hand stopped in midair. Something in the boy's eyes told her this wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a warning. From behind her, Amamira's voice called out, Deborah! Deborah turned. The captain needs to see you in the cockpit now. Why? He received a directive from LunaJet Executive Operations. Something about a protocol breach. Deborah paused slightly. What kind of breach? He wouldn't say, just that it concerns a passenger in 2A and requires immediate review. Micah didn't move. The Oprah looked up from 3C, removed his glasses, and finally spoke. I'd recommend you go, Ms. Cray. His voice was low controlled, but it had an edge that didn't invite argument. Deborah didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked quickly toward the front of the cabin. Once she disappeared through the cockpit door, the passengers leaned into the quiet that followed. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone knew something had just changed. In 2A, Micah remained still, hands resting on the tray's shoulders straight. He didn't need to raise his voice. The system was already listening. Behind the cockpit door, muffled voices clashed like colliding waves. The first-class cabin remained eerily still, suspended in a strange quiet that seemed to hum louder than the engines. Micah Ellison hadn't moved. His posture in seat 2A was calm, but it carried weight. He sat like someone waiting for something he already knew was coming. Not hoping, not begging, just waiting with quiet precision. Passengers whispered in low tones now. Some speculated about delays, while others stole glances toward the boy in the envelope still sitting untouched on his tray table. The same envelope the lead flight attendant had tried to seize moments earlier. In 3C, Theo Price adjusted the cuffs of his suit and checked his secondary phone. It pulsed twice with a secure vibration. Ellison protocol escalation confirmed. Flight LJ-88 primary response underway. Do not interfere unless child is physically endangered. Theo slipped the phone back into his inside pocket. Then he looked at Micah. The boy's face was unreadable, but Theo saw something in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, resolve in the cockpit. Deborah CR stood with arms folded as the captain reread the message on his tablet for the 3rd time. His brow was furrowed, mouth pulled into a tense line. He had flown for LunaJet for 17 years. He'd never received an encrypted executive override on a domestic route, much less about a 10-year-old child. Are you absolutely sure this isn't some hoax? Deborah demanded. The captain didn't look up. He handed the tablet to the co-pilot and pulled out the emergency communications protocol binder. The directive didn't come through public channels. It was routed through LunaJet's board office with direct authentication from Ellison Holdings. Deborah crossed her arms tighter. So that kid, he's what some trust fund brat. The co-pilot turned toward her, voice colder now. That kid is listed as a protected asset under a level alpha designation. Same level we assign to dignitaries and foreign ministers. The system flagged your interaction with him. Deborah's face flushed. So what does that mean? He gets to throw a tantrum and ground a flight. The captain finally looked up. What it means, Ms. Cray, is that any further missteps on your part will trigger a federal review of crew conduct. If this boy was assaulted or mishandled under your watch, you're not just looking at suspension, you're looking at termination, public scrutiny, and a possible investigation into criminal misconduct. Deborah's mouth opened, but no words came. She had worked decades to rise to lead flight status. She had kept her hair tight, her shoes, polished her record clean. Now all of it teetered on the edge of a boy's silence. She turned away from the instrument panel and took a long breath, but it didn't clear the fog in her chest. He was just a kid. Just a kid. She whispered it again, but this time it didn't feel like truth. It felt like denial. Back in the cabin, Micah's eyes had drifted toward the window. The tarmac outside was bathed in afternoon light. Planes moved in and out of gates like choreographed dancers, but LJ-88 remained still, rooted. Mrs. Ralph leaned forward slightly in her seat across the aisle. Do you know what I used to do before I retired? Micah turned slightly. I was a school principal for 38 years, she said. Middle school. Imagine that. He offered the faintest smile. I saw thousands of kids come and go. Most people don't listen to children when they speak, but I made it a point to really hear them. Not just what they said out loud, but what they didn't say. The silences matter sometimes more than words. Micah nodded once. He understood exactly what she meant. When I saw you this morning, she continued, I noticed how calmly you carried yourself, the way you folded your hoodie, the way you spoke to that gate agent. You were raised with purpose. Micah's eyes lowered. My mom says dignity isn't something you wait for. You carry it even when no one else sees it. Mrs. Rose's hand rested gently on her armrest. Your mom is right, and I imagine she's very proud of you. In the back of the cabin, a commotion stirred. 2 uniformed security officers had boarded quietly and were making their way forward. Their movements weren't rushed, but they were focused. One of them tapped his comm device, approaching seat 2A now. Passengers leaned out into the aisles, curiosity replacing tension. The taller officer, a man named Raymond, reached the front and stopped beside Micah. Young man, he said gently, may I confirm your name? Micah looked up, voice steady. Micah Ellison. Raymond nodded. I'm Officer Raymond with Airport Security. I've been instructed to verify your safety and confirm that no harm has come to you aboard this flight. Micah glanced at the envelope on his tray table. It was sealed with a gold insignia that shimmered under the overhead light. The Ellison Foundation crest beneath it in fine lettering was a phrase embossed in Latin Veritas Incensio. Truth in silence. Micah picked up the envelope and handed it to the officer. My clearance and statement are inside. Raymond took the envelope respectfully without opening it. I'll deliver this to the appropriate channel, he said. In the meantime, is there anything you need? Any discomfort or concern you want? Documented. Micah paused. I don't need anything, but then his voice softened. I just want people to stop assuming I'm not supposed to be here. Raymond nodded slowly. We'll make sure that's heard. He stepped aside as Theo Price stood from his seat in 3C and walked forward. He flashed a badge, subtle matte black, nothing like a regular ID. I'll be escorting the child for the duration of this flight, Theo said under level Alpha Guardian clearance. Raymond acknowledged him. Understood. Deborah Cray had returned from the cockpit just in time to hear that last line. Her face went pale. Theo turned to her, his voice flat. If you touch him again, if you speak to him again without clearance, if you so much as raise your voice, you will not be suspended. You will be escorted from this aircraft in restraints. Deborah stood frozen. Amamira, standing just behind her, said nothing. She didn't need to. Micah leaned back into his seat. He reached down and zipped his duffel shut. The plane still hadn't moved. Passengers waited, some silent, some filming. Somewhere in row 5, a teenage girl quietly uploaded her earlier clip to social media. Within 2 minutes, it would cross 50,000 views. Within 20, it would be trending. Micah took one final breath and tapped his smart band. Hold protocol complete. The plane could now move, but the story would not. Somewhere above the clouds, just minutes after the hold was lifted on Flight LJ88, the world had already begun to change. Micah Ellison felt the wheels finally move beneath the aircraft as it pushed back from the gate. The engines hummed with the quiet power of progress, but the real engine had been triggered long before the aircraft moved. It began with a signal. It continued with a silent camera. It exploded with a single call. The moment Micah tapped his smart band to release the hold, a secured communication platform activated on the servers of the Ellison Foundation in Washington, D.C. An AI assistant automatically transcribed the event into a report catalog passenger footage from the flight and sent a single alert to a private number. On the rooftop of the Ellison Center in Manhattan, Dr. Alana Ellison stood barefoot on the terrace of her penthouse suite. Her morning meeting had just wrapped. She was sipping green tea and listening to the wind move through the trees when her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She didn't check it immediately. Her world was flooded with information. But when she saw the subject line, Micah Level 2 Escalation, reported LJ88, her hand tightened around the cup. She stepped back inside and closed the sliding door. Her executive assistant, Marcus Lynn, looked up from the screen at the table. Dr. Ellison, she didn't speak. She simply raised her phone and dialed 3 rings. Then a quiet voice answered, "Yes, Dr. Ellison, activate the crisis protocol. Now I want a private conference with LunaJet's executive board in the next 15 minutes. I want every camera feed pulled from Flight LJ88, passenger manifest, crew files, incident logs, and Marcus." She paused, her voice cool as glass. "Make sure the board understands what happens when someone tries to humiliate my child on my watch." "Yes, ma'am." Back on Flight LJ88, the cabin lights dimmed as the plane taxied slowly toward the runway. Micah sat in two-way, his body relaxed but his mind alert. He could feel it happen in the shift. It didn't come with noise or flashing lights. It came with awareness, with the way the passengers sat a little straighter, with the way Deborah C.R. no longer walked with quite the same confidence. Her movements were quieter, now calculated. She was no longer running the show from across the aisle. Mrs. Rowe gave Micah a soft smile. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her expression said it all. "You did that behind them." Amamira Calderon checked her service tablet again. The message that had flashed moments earlier still glowed at the top of the screen. Special Services Directive. Do not engage passenger 2A unless prompted. Await contact from ground ops. Amamira had never seen that kind of order in her 2 years with LunaJet. It was clean, firm, absolute. She looked toward the front of the cabin where Deborah stood near the galley, her face tight, her jaw set. Deborah wasn't speaking. She was watching a world slip out of her control. In 3C, Theo Price remained seated, legs crossed, fingers tap in a silent pattern on his armrest. He had received his own notification 5 minutes ago. Internal counsel had reviewed the in-cabin footage. Charges would be filed post-landing. Deborah C.R. was already flagged for review by the airline's ethics board, and most significantly, all footage had been transferred to Dr. Alana Ellison's personal team of legal strategists. This wasn't a social media scandal. This wasn't a slap and go. This was a corporate reckoning. The plane's nose tilted slightly upward as they left the ground. Micah glanced at the clouds rushing past the window. They looked soft, like dreams, like the pillows his mom used to pile beside him when he was sick. There was something healing about seeing the world from above, something that reminded him how small things could be, and yet how big their consequences were. He thought about the slap again, about the sting on his cheek, the tearing sound of his clearance letter, the way Deborah's voice had dropped when she spoke to him. She hadn't seen a child. She hadn't seen a person. She had seen a mistake. Micah had no way of knowing that over 200,000 people were now watching the video of her mistake. He had no way of knowing that by the time the plane landed in New York, 10 different reporters would be waiting at the terminal. But what he did know was something even heavier. He knew how fast people could make you feel invisible and how quiet the world could get when you demanded to be seen anyway. A sudden chime pulled him out of his thoughts. The seatbelt sign dimmed. "You doing okay?" Theo asked from beside him, now seated in 2B. After coordinating with the captain, Micah nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay." Theo nodded too. His eyes searched the boy's face. He saw the bruise now forming near Micah's cheekbone. Just faint, but unmistakable. "I've documented everything Theo said. You won't have to retell this, not unless you want to. Thank you. You don't owe anyone your story, but if you ever choose to share it, you'll be ready." Micah turned back to the window. His reflection in the glass looked older somehow, like something inside him had changed shape from the front galley. Deborah watched them both. She didn't speak. She had nothing left to say. Every protocol in her manual was now useless. The only thing she could do was wait for the fallout. It was coming, not with yelling, but with precision. She thought about the moment her hand had made contact with Micah's cheek. She had acted on something she never would have admitted aloud, the flicker of discomfort she felt when he walked into first class. Alone, confident, brown-skinned, soft-spoken, too calm for a child she thought should have been fidgeting, or unsure she had seen that as arrogance. But now sitting with the realization that his mother controlled more than she could ever hope to, Deborah saw what it actually was. It was strength. Back in 2A, Micah reached into his bag and pulled out a small notepad. It was old-school paper and pen. He opened to a blank page and wrote 2 simple sentences. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to." He underlined them slowly across the aisle. Mrs. Rose smiled. He saw her watching and gave a tiny nod. Then he closed the notebook and let the plane carry them forward. 30,000 FTFT. In the air, the weight of a name settled differently. It wasn't printed on a seat ticket or stitched into a uniform. It wasn't whispered in quiet prejudice or shouted in defense. It lived in silence in the spaces between injustice and justice, in the tension between the bruising and the healing. Micah Ellison's name now hung in the air like a thread of lightning, quietly stretching across the cloud line, and in the small, carefully ordered world of a LunaJet first-class cabin, everyone had finally learned to listen to it. The plane had leveled off above the weather. The usual hum of cruising altitude had returned, but this time it carried an undercurrent. Not noise exactly, more like awareness. Deborah C.R. sat stiffly in the forward jump seat, arms folded, lips pressed together. She had no clipboard now, no tray service. She had been removed from in-flight duties by command from LunaJet's Central Ops office. She was still technically on the clock, but no one was listening to her anymore. Not Amira, who now carried out beverage service with a renewed clarity and quiet grace. Not the captain, who had passed her the executive decision memo without comment, and certainly not Micah Ellison, who had already learned something most adults never do: how to rise without rising, how to disrupt without shouting, how to shift power through presence alone. Theo Price remained seated next to him, not as a guard, not even as a lawyer anymore, but simply as a watchful witness. His job was nearly done. Micah had handled more than anyone could have asked. Now it was about the follow-through. "Would you like anything?" Amira asked quietly as she reached their row. Micah looked up. "Sparkling water, please." She nodded and handed him a bottle with gentle fingers. "Thank you for being decent," he said barely above a whisper. Amira's face softened. She paused just long enough to meet his eyes. "I should have spoken up sooner. You did when it mattered." She gave a tiny nod and moved on. In the seat behind them, Mrs. Rowe quietly wrote in her notebook. She had been journaling for over an hour now, stopping only to look up and observe moments that felt like history in motion. Her page read, "This was not just about one boy. It never is. It was about the people who believe they can shrink others to feel taller, and what happens when someone refuses to shrink." She paused, tapped her pen twice on the page, and then underlined the word "refuses." Behind her in the main cabin, the buzz had grown louder. Someone in row 8 had recognized Micah's last name. They had seen it once on a building, the Ellison Library at Stanford. Or maybe it was on the front page of Forbes next to the headline, "The Woman Who Quietly Redefined Global Aid." Whatever the source, the recognition began to spread like a ripple. A few passengers had already opened their phones mid-air, connecting to the satellite Wi-Fi. LunaJet hadn't blocked service on this flight, and now social media platforms were beginning to catch fire. The video was everywhere: Deborah's voice, Micah's silence, the torn letter, the slap, the stillness. Even without audio for some, the image said enough. And in the background of that image, sharp-eyed viewers had already picked out Theo Price, quiet, composed legal handler for Ellison Holdings. If he was on the plane, then this wasn't just an incident. This was a test case, maybe even a corporate trap. Somewhere in a boardroom in Atlanta, LunaJet's VP of Crisis Communications received a ping that turned her stomach inside out. It was a trending tag. Ellison Flight 88 under it. 3 million views, 30,000 reposts, a full thread breaking down the video timeline, and worse, a screen grab of Deborah's face with the caption, "She slapped the wrong boy." Back in the air, Deborah had begun to feel the shift. She looked at her reflection in the stainless steel of the forward galley. The eyes that stared back were sharper than she remembered. Not cold, but tired. Tired in the way people get when the story they told themselves collapses. He had disrespected protocol, she muttered under her breath, as if trying to argue with her own reflection. He looked out of place. She knew those weren't good enough anymore. She remembered how quickly she'd reached for power. Not procedure, not safety, just control. She remembered the feel of the paper between her fingers as she tore it. The way he didn't resist, the way he didn't cry, just watched her, steady and still. Now her hands felt useless. Her badge felt like paper, her rank temporary. She turned to the cabin and saw him again sitting next to Theo, drinking sparkling water like it was fine wine, writing in a notepad. He was more composed than most executives she'd served in her career. And now, with her ears ringing and stomach hollow, she finally saw him. Not a threat, not a glitch. A boy, a brilliant, brave boy who'd already rewritten her future. In 2A, Micah turned the page in his notebook. He wrote a new sentence. Slow and careful, sometimes the quiet ones are not afraid. They're preparing. He underlined that too. Theo watched him write. He smiled just slightly. You know, he said, your mother is already preparing the legal strategy for what happens next. Micah didn't stop writing. She told me once that sometimes justice has to be louder than the injustice. Theo nodded. She's not just loud, she's smart. She plays long games, strategic ones, which means this isn't just about you anymore. Micah closed the notebook. I know, but it started with me, and I'm okay with that. The plane continued toward New York, slicing through the clouds with the kind of calm precision that mirrored Micah's own presence. At 30,000 FT, things became clearer, truer. The distance forced people to see themselves not just as passengers, but as participants, witnesses, carriers of accountability. And as the aircraft moved through the sky, so did the weight of Micah Ellison's name. It had always been powerful. Now it had become undeniable. The flight crew didn't say much anymore. No welcome announcements, no beverage refills, just the occasional overhead reminder to stay seated and keep seatbelts fastened. Everything else had gone quiet, a kind of hush that didn't feel like courtesy. It felt like consequence. Micah Ellison sat in seat 2A. His face turned toward the window, but he wasn't looking at clouds. He was watching his own reflection in the glass. The swelling on his cheek had dulled to a soft pink now, a shadow of what it was. It didn't hurt as much anymore. Not on the outside. Theo Price beside him in 2B was watching the cabin discreetly. He wasn't just an attorney, though his legal background was flawless. He was a strategist. He was trained to watch the ripple of power when it moved. And right now the ripple had reached the passengers across the aisle. Mrs. Lillian Rowe scrolled slowly through her phone. She'd been sent a link moments ago by a student she hadn't taught in 20 years. I just saw your face on Twitter. The message read, "Is that you? Is that Micah Ellison?" She clicked the link. There it was, the full 28-second video. The audio was fuzzy, but you could hear Deborah Kiar's voice clearly. You do not belong here. The slap came quick. So did the silence after it. Micah didn't scream, didn't cry. He blinked once. That was all. The video cut to black with the words, Ellison Flight 88 misses. Rowe pressed a hand to her chest, not because she was shocked. She had seen things like this for years in schools and churches and PTA meetings, but because the world had finally seen it too. She turned toward Micah and smiled softly. He looked up. "It's already begun," she said. "What has to change?" A few rows behind a young man with a laptop open in seat 5C refreshed his feed again. Every time he did, the numbers jumped. $320,000 views. 681.1 million. He wasn't even supposed to be on this flight. Last-minute standby. Now he was watching a story unfold in real time that he had seen with his own eyes an hour earlier. He started typing a thread. "Let me tell you what I just saw on Flight LJ Etihad. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a kid being difficult. This was a black child in first class, sitting quietly who got slapped by a flight attendant simply for existing where she didn't think he should be." In less than 15 minutes, it had been reposted over 10,000 times. Somewhere in Brooklyn, a middle school teacher read the thread and forwarded it to her colleagues. Somewhere in Oakland, a mother called her son into the room and said, "This is why we talk about this." And somewhere high above the country, Micah Ellison was sipping water and letting the wind carry his name further than any seat number ever could. Theo received a silent notification on his watch. Phase 2 engagement has begun. Media team activated. Legal team in position. Dr. Ellison is live with Luna Jetboard. He glanced sideways at Micah. "Your mom's in the boardroom now." Micah nodded but said nothing. "She doesn't yell," Theo added. "She doesn't threaten. She just waits for people to speak, then lets them realize how foolish they sound." "I know," Micah said softly. "That's how she raised me." He paused. "But I'm still mad." "You should be, but I don't want to stay mad. I just want them to see what they did." Theo looked ahead. "They already do, and they're terrified." He pointed subtly toward the jump seat across the aisle. Deborah C.R. sat frozen arms locked across her chest, lips pale, her eyes flicked from screen to screen. A passenger had shown her the clip. She had seen her own hand in slow motion. The comments, the quote tweets, the captions. She said he didn't belong. He never said a word. She'll regret this forever. Somewhere deep in her chest, something began to tremble. Not because she'd been caught, but because she had meant it. Every word, every gesture, every ounce of superiority. It hadn't come from nowhere. It had always been there. Now it was public. Amamira Calderon walked the aisle slowly, collecting empty cups. Her hands shook a little, not from fear but from awakening. She had always been the quiet one, the one who smoothed over uncomfortable moments with smiles. But today her silence had nearly made her complicit. She stopped at Micah's row. "Would you like anything else?" Micah looked up, eyes gentle. "No, thank you." She lingered a second longer. "I was scared. I know I shouldn't have been, but I was." "You're doing better now." His voice was quiet but sure, and in that single exchange, Amamira felt something lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. She moved on. Back at the front, Deborah felt her breath hitch. She had tried to tell herself he was arrogant. She had convinced herself that he was being disruptive, but the footage didn't lie, and now neither could she. He had been still respectful, dignified. She had been the opposite. Her career was already dissolving. Messages from her union rep, a freeze on her payroll account, a pending summons from the ethics board. But worse than all of it was the shame. She had slapped a child, and not just any child. Micah Ellison in two-way. Micah pulled out his notebook again. He wrote something in small letters. "They only believe you when it's recorded, but I knew before the camera did." He closed the cover. The captain's voice came through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching cruising altitude. We will begin in-flight services shortly. Please remain seated as we pass through the cabin." But there was no service. There was only silence, the kind that comes when a system knows it's been seen. Inside a towering glass building overlooking the East River, a boardroom sat in stunned silence. It was not a silence of confusion. It was the silence that follows realization. Realization that something irreversible had occurred, and there was no way to walk it back without leaving pieces behind. Dr. Alana Ellison stood at the head of the long marble conference table, her black slacks sharp, her blouse pristine. The room was mostly men, gay-haired, expensive suits, well-fed confidence, but not one of them spoke, while she reviewed the footage again on the screen behind her. Micah never even raised his voice, she said quietly. That's how little power he assumed he had in that moment. And still, he was assaulted. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need it to. This isn't just about public relations, Alana continued. This is about corporate culture. This is about racial profiling. This is about a child. My child being told he didn't belong because he was sitting in first class while black and alone. A woman from legal seated 2 seats to the right shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Ellison, we understand how serious this is, and we're reviewing. No, Alana's voice cut gently but firmly. You're not reviewing, you're reacting. And unfortunately, that's too late, which is why I've already submitted a formal request to pull Ellison Foundation travel partnerships from LunaJet pending full restructuring of your anti-B policy, ground staff training, and in-air protocols. The CEO of LunaJet, Patrick Marston, finally leaned forward. His voice was measured. Dr. Ellison, we want to make this right truly, but grounding flights, threatening contracts, those are escalations with major commercial consequences. You could be disrupting an entire network of routes and partnerships. Alana's eyes held his without blinking. My son was slapped by your employee in front of dozens of witnesses. She said on a plane I paid to be on with security clearance issued through your own VIP platform. If you're worried about disruption, Mr. Marston, then I suggest you review your employee hiring and evaluation systems. Not my response. Patrick swallowed once. The PR manager leaned in from his side of the table. We're drafting a public apology as we speak, and we're open to collaborating with the Foundation on community programs. Joint statements. Alana raised a hand slightly. I don't want a joint statement. I want acknowledgement, and I want consequence. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern that finally got caught in public view. You don't fix a pattern with a press release. She turned and clicked the remote. The screen behind her flashed again. Micah's face post-lap steady, quiet, not crying, not shouting, just still. Elena let the image breathe for a moment. Then she turned off the screen. I want her removed before the wheels touch down in New York. No suspension termination and not for optics for accountability. She gathered her folder, her tablet, and her phone. The meeting is over, she said. I have to meet my son at the gate. No one followed her out. No one dared. Back on flight LJ-888, clouds blanketed the windows like a slow-moving sea. Micah sat quietly writing again in his notebook. He had titled this page, What They Think They Know. He wrote, They think because I didn't yell, I wasn't hurt. They think because I stayed calm, I was okay. But sometimes silence is just the pause before the storm, and sometimes a storm doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like a name. He closed the notebook. Theo checked the time. We'll be starting to scent soon, Micah nodded. Do you want me to walk you off the flight, or would you prefer to meet your mother alone? Micah thought for a long moment. Then he smiled. I want her to see me just like this. Calm, upright, still here. You sure? Yeah, she'll understand. She always does. Theo nodded behind them. Mrs. Rowe tapped gently on the armrest. Micah, if you ever decide to speak publicly, I hope you remember this moment. Which one? This one. Right now, where you're not bitter, where you're not trying to prove anything, just existing fully in who you are. It's rare and it's powerful. Thank you. Micah said that means a lot. Her eyes welled just slightly, but she blinked it back. Amira approached with a tray of tissues and mints, trying to maintain the small dignity of service. When she reached Micah's row, she didn't offer either. Instead, she knelt slightly. I requested to be on this flight because I wanted experience. I got more than I asked for. Micah looked at her gently. You still have time to be the person you want to be. Her mouth twitched like it wanted to smile, but wasn't sure if it had the right to. Then she stood and walked back toward the galley. The captain's voice came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our initial descent into John F. Kennedy Airport shortly. Please ensure your tray tables are up and your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants will conduct a final check. Micah buckled his belt and looked out the window. The clouds were breaking below. The edges of New York were starting to come into view. Not just the city, but the enormity of what waited there. He could already feel the change, and he was ready to walk into it. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, but it wasn't the touchdown that made hearts skip. It was what waited on the ground from seat 2A. Micah Ellison didn't flinch as the brakes engaged, and the aircraft rolled steadily toward the gate. His fingers rested on his closed notebook. His posture remained upright, calm, almost too calm for a 10-year-old who had just become the center of national attention. Across the aisle, Mrs. Rao had put away her journal, but kept her eyes forward. She wasn't watching the seatbelt sign. She was watching Micah quietly, reverently, as if bearing witness to history in motion. In the front jump seat, Deborah C.R. sat motionless. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale. Her badge was gone, removed hours ago at the request of the executive team. Her final assignment on this flight was to wait in silence for what came next. Amamira Calderon stood beside the front galley curtain, tablet in hand, awaiting final clearance. But it wasn't for routine cabin checks. It was to confirm that all passengers were seated and calm, because what waited outside the jet bridge was no ordinary deboarding. Theo Price turned to Micah as the engines powered down. Remember, you walk out on your own terms. No interviews unless you feel ready. No questions unless you want to answer them. You control the pace. Micah nodded. He hadn't spoken much in the past half hour. His silence was no longer about shock or pain. It was deliberate now. It was a choice. Every word he saved carried weight. A soft chime signaled that the doors had been unlocked. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York," the captain said through the intercom. "Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate and the seatbelt sign is off. On behalf of Luna Jet, thank you for flying with us." No one moved. The jet bridge was already swarming, not with TSA or airport staff, but with media crews, civil rights lawyers, foundation representatives, and Dr. Atlanta Ellison herself. Her heels clicked quietly across the jetway floor as she approached the aircraft. No entourage, no security detail. Just her calm, controlled, poised as ever. The moment the door opened, Deborah instinctively looked away. Amamira stood straighter. Micah didn't move until he heard the voice. "Micah, baby." His eyes finally shifted. He stood slowly and turned. When he saw his mother in the doorway, all the calm he'd held on to for hours loosened slightly, just enough for the corners of his mouth to rise. She didn't rush him. She didn't smother him. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. He leaned into her just long enough to breathe in the lavender scent of her jacket. "Home, you did so well," she whispered. "I saw everything, and you carried it better than most grown men ever could." He didn't cry, but his arms tightened around her waist. "Thank you for showing them who you are." Behind them, the flash of cameras reflected off the fuselage as security kept media at bay. The footage had already gone viral. Now the faces behind the story were being captured in real time. Micah pulled back and straightened his hoodie. "Are we going home?" "Not yet. There's a press line waiting if you want to speak." "You don't have to." He looked past her toward the windows of Terminal D. Dozens of passengers, staff, and strangers stood holding phones. A few held signs. One said, "We believe you, Micah." Another, "He belongs." His eyes narrowed on a third sign, handwritten with black marker. She slapped a boy and woke a movement. "I'll speak," he said. Elena didn't flinch. "You sure?" "Yes, but only a few words. That's all it takes," she said. Theo stepped forward. "We'll go through the side jet bridge. Media is on the right. Statement podium is set." Micah nodded and turned to face the cabin. Everyone in first class was watching now. Even the passengers who hadn't said a word the entire flight. A few of them stood one by one. Mrs. Rao stood too. She met his gaze and gave a single proud nod. Micah returned it. Then he turned, walked past the galley, and exited the plane with quiet confidence. As the crowd surged near the podium, Alana stepped to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "My name is Dr. Elena Ellison, and this is my son, Micah. He has something brief he wants to share. After that, we will not be taking questions." Micah stepped forward. The chatter dimmed. His small hand reached for the microphone, and he looked out at the crowd. He didn't clear his throat, didn't shift nervously. He just spoke. "I was sitting where I was supposed to sit. Someone decided I didn't belong there. They hurt me, but I didn't shout. I didn't hit back because I knew who I was. And now you do too." He stepped away. The crowd held a collective breath. Then came the applause. Not wild, not performative. It was steady, respectful, true. Micah turned and walked off the platform beside his mother behind them. Deborah C.R. watched through the jet bridge window. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew what he had said, and she knew the silence that followed would haunt her more than any reprimand ever could. Because it wasn't just a boy who spoke, it was the sound of accountability. The Luna Jet executive floor was unusually quiet that Monday morning. No clinking coffee mugs, no hallway chatter, no cheerful greetings, just the low buzz of whispered conversations and a pressure in the air that couldn't be measured in altitude. On the 36th floor, Deborah C.R. sat in a glass-walled conference room with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her uniform was gone. She wore a plain blouse now pale and wrinkled with her employee ID badge sitting face down on the table. Across from her, two members of Luna Jet's internal ethics panel reviewed a thick folder labeled Incident LJ88. The woman in the middle, senior compliance officer, Melinda Dupont, finally looked up. Miss C.R., we've reviewed the footage from multiple angles as well as statements from 5 separate passengers and 2 crew members. We also have audio from the cockpit and a timeline of your onboard actions. Deborah nodded, her throat dry. Would you like to make a statement before we proceed with disciplinary determination? She hesitated. The impulse to defend herself had been there at first, but that was before she watched herself on screen, slapping the 10-year-old boy across the face like she owned the air he breathed. No, I understand what I did. Dupont raised an eyebrow. You understand? You violated 5 separate codes of conduct and may have exposed the company to litigation exceeding 7 figures. Yes, you understand that your actions triggered not only an internal review, but the suspension of 6 foundation contracts worth over $80 million. Yes, you understand that you struck a child. Deborah blinked, the words hitting harder than the slap she had delivered. Yes, I understand that. The room was silent for a moment. She exhaled. I didn't think he belonged. That's the truth. I saw a black boy alone in the first class, looking confident, and something in me just assumed he was out of place. Melinda leaned forward. So, you weaponized your assumption. Deborah looked down. Shame colored her cheeks. Yes. Thank you for your honesty. You're hereby terminated from your role effective immediately. Your union representative has been notified and severance is under review. Luna Jet will issue a formal apology to the Ellison family today. Deborah nodded again. She didn't fight. There was no room left for deflection. Not anymore. Down in the press center, just a few floors below, journalists gathered for Luna Jet's scheduled statement. A podium stood beneath a wall-sized screen looping the company's logo in soft blue. The CEO, Patrick Marston, stepped up with eyes like glass and a voice that didn't dare falter. Today, Luna Jet accepts full responsibility for the actions of one of our flight attendants during Flight LJ88. We offer our sincerest apologies to Micah Ellison and his family. We recognize that this incident is not isolated, but reflective of deeper systemic issues in our industry. Effective immediately, Luna Jet will undergo mandatory racial bias training conduct, a full review of internal policies, and partner with the Ellison Foundation on an oversight council. The room was quiet, not out of respect, but out of scrutiny. Everyone was watching to see whether the words were just air. Micah wasn't in the room. He was home finally, not in a mansion or a penthouse, but in his room, surrounded by books and space shuttles. His old drawings taped to the wall. He sat on the floor with his notebook flipping back through the pages he'd written on the flight. A knock came at the door. Come in. Elena entered with a plate of grilled cheese and sliced apple. She didn't say anything, just set it beside him on the floor. He looked up at her. Did I do the right thing? She paused. You told the truth, and you did it without cruelty. That's rare and powerful. He closed the notebook and reached for the apple. I keep thinking about her face. Deborah. Yeah. When I left the plane, she looked scared. Not like someone afraid of getting fired, like someone afraid of herself. Alana sat beside him. Maybe she was. Sometimes when people are finally forced to see what they're capable of, it shakes them. Do you think she'll change? I don't know, but I do know that you gave her that chance. You didn't scream. You didn't hit back. You gave her a mirror. He chewed slowly, thinking, I didn't want to be a mirror. I just wanted to be left alone. I know. She ran her hand gently over his braids, but sometimes the world sees strength in you before you even know it's there. That's what happened. You became more than a passenger. You became a signal. He looked at her. Will it happen again to someone else? Probably. But next time, more people will notice. More people will speak up because of you. He leaned his head against her shoulder. I'm tired. Then rest. You've earned that much. Elsewhere across the country, the video of Micah's speech was being shared by teachers, ministers, parents, and celebrities. He had become a symbol not because he asked to, but because of how he carried himself when the world got loud. In classrooms, students were watching and discussing the slap and the silence that followed. In boardrooms, DEI officers were citing Flight L-88 as a turning point. And in newsrooms, journalists debated whether this was justice or just a performance. But none of that noise reached Micah in his room. He was a boy again now. Not a trend in name, not a headline, just Micah. And that was enough. A week had passed. Not 7 days of routine, but 7 days of noise, attention, reflection. For Micah Ellison, the world had changed more outside his home than within it. Inside the Ellison brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, things were quiet again. Morning tea steeped on the counter. The scent of lavender and cedar lingered in the hall. Micah was in the study, perched in his favorite window seat. Sunlight warming his face as he flipped through pages of a well-worn astronomy journal. But he wasn't reading. Not really. His mind kept circling back to the moment of the slap to the pause before he stood up to the hundreds of people who now knew his name, his face, his story. He heard footsteps approach behind him. His mother entered quietly, holding a slim white envelope. She placed it on the windowsill. For you. What is it? A letter from Luna Jet. Micah raised an eyebrow. Is it an apology? Not exactly. More like acknowledgement. He opened it slowly, pulling out a typed message on official letterhead. Dear Mr. Ellison, we have completed our internal review and issued the necessary terminations, apologies, and public statements. But we also understand that the true resolution lies not in press releases, but in action. In that spirit, we are launching the Passenger Equity Initiative, a long-term policy shift in partnership with Your Family's Foundation, focused on mandatory racial sensitivity training for all flight staff, independent audits of passenger complaints, a whistleblower platform to protect both passengers and crew. We know this does not erase what you experienced, but we hope it can mean fewer stories like yours in the future. Respectfully, Patrick Marston, Chief Executive Officer, Luna Jet. Micah folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. He looked up at his mother. Do you believe them? Atlanta sat beside him. I believe they're scared, which means they're listening, and sometimes fear opens the door for truth to walk in. Micah nodded slowly. You know, he said, I didn't plan to become a symbol. I didn't want to be someone's headline. You didn't have to plan it. You just had to show up. The world did the rest. He let that sit outside the window. A soft breeze shifted the leaves on the stoop. I saw a video yesterday. Micah said a boy in Texas, he was removed from a gate for asking why his boarding group was skipped over. Same airline, different one, but same feeling, same look in the staff's eyes. What did he do? Same thing I did. Nothing. He just existed. Elena leaned back against the wall, fingers tracing the ridges of her teacup. It's going to take more than policies to fix what people carry inside them. I know, but what you did started something. That's more than most. Micah looked down at his lap where his notebook rested again. He hadn't written in it since the day of the flight. Now he opened to a blank page. What happens after the headlines, he wrote. He stared at the question for a long while before adding, that's where the real story begins. Later that afternoon, though, Price joined them for a meeting in the sunroom. His briefcase was slimmer than usual, and his smile was lighter. So he said, I have news. The Foundation's media office has been flooded with school requests. They want Micah to speak. Interviews, town halls, youth panels. Everyone wants a piece of him. Micah frowned slightly. Is that good? Elena answered before Theo could. It's flattering, but it's also a lot. You don't owe anyone your story. You don't have to relive what happened just because people are finally ready to listen. Micah leaned forward. What if I say no? Will it seem like I'm hiding? Theo shook his head. No, it'll look like you're choosing peace and boundaries. Micah sighed, then stood and walked to the bookshelf. His fingers skimmed the spines before pulling down a hardcover narratives of resistance, young voices and civil rights. He opened to a bookmarked chapter and read aloud. The burden of becoming a symbol is not that the world watches, but that it never stops watching. Choose when to let them in. He looked up at Theo. I'll think about it, but I'm not ready yet. That's more than fair. Meanwhile, outside the home, the ripple continued. Deborah C.R. had not appeared on any morning shows. She declined interviews, refused comment, and disappeared from public view. Some speculated that she'd been advised to lay low for legal reasons. Others assumed she was simply ashamed. But one journalist had tracked down a friend of hers from flight school. The friend, a woman named Rachel, offered only this. She told me she couldn't stop replaying the moment, not just the slap, but the feeling before it. She said it was like all her prejudices had been waiting for a moment to act. And when they did, she couldn't take it back. No lawsuit had been filed against her personally, not yet. But LunaJet's legal department remained on high alert. Meanwhile, back at the Ellison Foundation headquarters, an entire division was created for the Passenger Equity Initiative. Micah's name was on the masthead, not as a title holder, but as a reference point, a reminder. And one afternoon, a small package arrived. Inside was a wooden plaque engraved with 3 simple lines. To belong without question is a right. No sender, no note, just truth. That evening, Micah sat alone in his room, watching the city lights flickered to life. He thought about the flight again, the press, the questions, the silence. Then he opened his notebook once more and wrote, "They thought it was about the slap. It never was. It was about the seat, the space, the right to exist without needing to prove why." He closed the notebook and turned off the light. 3 months later, Terminal B at LaGuardia looked no different than usual. Neon signs pulsed gently over the food court. Toddlers tugged on backpacks and boarding announcements echoed through the hall. But at Gate 3C, something had shifted. A new sign hung just above the gate desk, mounted discreetly in brushed bronze. Most passengers passed without noticing, but if they paused, they'd read the words engraved clearly. Every seat holds a life. Treat it with care. Passenger Equity Initiative established 2025. Micah Ellison, now 11, sat in one of the chairs nearby. Not in first class this time, not in any class. He wasn't flying today. He had come with his mother to attend a small, quiet, ribbon-cutting ceremony for the initiative's rollout across major airports. The media hadn't been invited. This was not for headlines. It was for presence. Dr. Elena Ellison stood a few feet away, speaking softly with a regional manager from LunaJet. Her tone was calm, as always, but there was weight in her stance. Respect wasn't something she demanded. It was something the air gave her now involuntarily. Micah watched her, then turned back to his notebook. He had written more in the past 3 months than in the 3 years before. Not essays or op-eds, just observations, thoughts, things he needed to hold somewhere. He flipped to a clean page and wrote, "Some things change with noise, but the most important things change in silence." Across the waiting area, a little boy tugged on his father's jacket and pointed toward the sign. "Dad, is that about the kid on the news?" The father looked, then nodded. "Yeah, that kid's name was Micah." The boy looked back at the plaque. He didn't even yell. That was the coolest part. Micah smiled quietly to himself. He hadn't come here for recognition. He didn't want applause. He just wanted to see what stayed behind after the dust settled. And what stayed was this, a reminder bolted to a wall. A few changed policies, a training module that flight staff now had to pass before entering the sky. Small things but permanent ones. Amamira Calderon had taken a job in the Passenger Equity Division after resigning from in-flight service. She was one of the first to complete the initiative's leadership certification. She had flown in for the event dressed in a navy blouse and a silver bracelet etched with the words, "We rise by lifting." When she spotted Micah, she smiled and came to sit beside him. "You look taller," she said. "I feel the same." She chuckled. "That's because your soul has always been tall." He turned his head. "How's the new job different, better? I actually feel like I'm doing something now. Not just handing out peanuts, you know. He laughed. I read about your new training curriculum. Amamira nodded proudly. All new hires have to pass it before their first flight. And we've added reflection journal in after every shift. They have to record one moment they noticed a bias someone else's or their own. Micah looked thoughtful. Does anyone write about me every week? She said, usually with gratitude, sometimes with guilt. He nodded. Good. He didn't ask for names. He didn't need them. Amamira rested a hand gently on his shoulder. Thank you again for what? For giving me permission to see it. I always felt something was off in the way we handled certain passengers, but I never called it out. Watching you sit there quietly holding your ground. That was my mirror. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. At that moment, Elena returned. They're ready, she said softly. Micah stood, straightened his hoodie, and followed her to the podium. There were no microphones, just a semicircle of chairs occupied by airport administrators, initiative organizers, and a few invited families who had experienced discrimination in the air. Alana stepped forward first. We are not here to erase the past, she said. We are here to insist on better futures. She nodded toward Micah. My son did not start this movement, but his restraint, his dignity reminded the world how much pain can exist inside silence, and how much power can rise from it too. Micah stepped up beside her. I don't have a long speech, he said. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who listened and to those who changed. I was hurt, but I'm healing. And the best way to help me heal is to make sure nobody else has to be that quiet to be treated right. He stepped back. There was no applause, just soft nods and wet eyes. That was enough. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Micah returned to the plaque. He ran his fingers along the engraved words, then took a deep breath. Are you ready? Elena asked. Almost. He pulled out his notebook one last time. Final entry, he said quietly, and he wrote, I'm not the boy from the plane anymore. I'm the boy who helped land something bigger, something that stays, and that's enough for me. Then he closed the book and walked away. Micah never shouted. He never raised a fist. He didn't need to, because sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is stillness. In a world that expected rage, Micah offered reflection. In a moment designed to humiliate, he showed grace. And in a system built to protect the aggressor, he reminded us all what it means to belong. Not because of a name, a bank account, or a boarding group, but because every human being deserves dignity. The slap wasn't just a mistake, it was a mirror. A mirror for an industry that too often confuses professionalism with prejudice, a mirror for a society that still decides who looks right in first class, and a mirror for each of us watching from the comfort of distance, wondering what we would do if it happened in front of us. Micah Ellison walked off that plane with more than bruised skin. He walked off with truth, and he used it not for revenge, but to build something that might outlast him, and that's how change begins. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think, if it made you feel, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Because the more we see stories like this, the more we see ourselves, and the more we refuse to look away. We'll see you in the next video. And until then, stay awake, stay kind, and